Pre-registered coordinates, drone surveillance, no escape route. This wasn't an ambush. This was an execution. The lead tanker rolls onto the pontoon. 40 meters of floating steel connecting two shores that Russian logistics planners had marked as a viable alternative crossing. The driver knows the risk. The convoy commander knows the risk. Every soldier watching from the tree line on the southern bank knows the risk. But the fuel has to move. The offensive is burning through diesel at a rate the railheads can't match. The southern grouping's armor is sitting idle without it, so the convoy rolls. What none of them know is that 80 kilometers north, hidden in a Ukrainian sunflower field, a HIMARS crew has been watching this crossing for days. Not hours. Days. They know the shift change patterns. They know which hours the Russian air defense coverage thins. They know the load capacity of that pontoon. 400 metric tons. Manufacturer rating, stretched to 600 under wartime necessity. They know, with the precision that only patient intelligence work produces, exactly how long it takes a fully loaded fuel tanker to reach the middle span. They have been waiting for this moment, and the rockets are already in the air. I'm your host at Ukraine Radar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're reconstructing one of the most tactically significant interdiction strikes of the entire Southern Front campaign, the destruction of Russia's emergency pontoon fuel crossing and the convoy that was crossing it when Ukrainian HIMARS rockets arrived. This is a story of patience, of intelligence, of the kind of precision the Russian southern grouping never believed Ukraine could achieve against a target this improvised, this temporary, this supposedly hidden. They were wrong about all of it. To understand why this crossing mattered so much, you need to understand what happened to the main bridge first, the Kerch Bridge, the physical and symbolic link between the Russian mainland and the occupied peninsula, had already taken multiple Ukrainian strikes over the course of the full-scale war. Ukrainian engineering and patience had turned the bridge from a confident Russian supply artery into a liability Moscow could never fully secure and never afford to lose. By the time the southern grouping's summer offensive was grinding into its operational phase, the Kerch Bridge was handling reduced loads under constant threat, with Russian logistics planners forced to route increasing supply volumes through alternative corridors along the Azov coast. The pontoon was that alternative. Russian military engineers had assembled it in less than 72 hours, working through 2 nights to string floating sections across a narrows point further along the Azov shoreline. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't permanent. It wasn't, in any meaningful tactical sense, safe. But it worked. And in the grinding mathematics of a major offensive, a crossing that works is a crossing that gets used. The southern grouping's fuel requirements during the active offensive period were running at roughly 800 to 1,100 metric tons of diesel per day across all armored and mechanized elements. Rail could handle perhaps 40%. The Kerch Bridge, operating at reduced capacity under threat protocols, could absorb another 30. The remaining 30% had to move by road, and road meant the pontoon, which made the pontoon a center of gravity. Ukrainian military planners understood this before the first Russian truck crossed it. OSINT analysts tracking satellite imagery of the Azov coastline had flagged the construction within hours of the first floating sections being laid. The imagery showed the pontoon's location, its orientation, its approach roads. The narrow, packed gravel track on the northern bank that funneled all traffic into a single choke point, and the marginally wider southern approach that spread into a dispersal area Russian engineers had scraped out of a former agricultural field. The dispersal area was a tell. It meant the Russians expected to use this crossing at volume. It meant they knew it was a target, and were trying to reduce dwell time on the crossing itself by keeping vehicles moving quickly off the far bank. Which weapon was deadlier in this type of interdiction strike? Was it A, HIMARS precision rockets, B, conventional artillery, or C, drone reconnaissance enabling the strike? Comment below. We'll break down the actual effectiveness comparison before this video ends. Ukrainian intelligence fusion brought together 3 separate streams to build the crossing pattern. Satellite imagery provided the macro picture. Convoy assembly points on the northern approach, the timing and spacing of vehicle movements, the positioning of Russian air defense systems covering the crossing. A Bayraktar TB2 operating at high altitude and extended range provided persistent surveillance that filled the gaps between satellite passes, its synthetic aperture radar tracking vehicle movement even through the light cloud cover the Azov coast produced in the early morning hours. And the third stream was human. Ukrainian partisan networks along the Azov coast had been active throughout the occupation, and the fuel convoy routes fell within areas where those networks had developed observation capability. Combined, these 3 streams gave Ukrainian strike planners something extraordinary, a predictive model for exactly when the heaviest fuel loads would be crossing. The pattern analysis pointed to a specific window, Russian convoy commanders were using the early morning hours, between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., to move the largest tanker columns, calculating that Ukrainian drone operations would be degraded by darkness and that their own air defense coverage would be most attentive during those hours. What they hadn't calculated was that Ukrainian strike planners had already accounted for all of this. The HIMARS M270 variant, positioned 80 kilometers north, was pre-registered on 4 specific coordinates along the pontoon crossing: the northern approach choke point, the northern pontoon attachment point, the center span, and the southern dispersal exit. 4 coordinates, pre-registered. No recalculation required when the order came. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes destroys an entire fuel convoy and reshapes Russian logistics planning for the entire southern front. The HIMARS crew had been in position for 61 hours before the strike order came. 61 hours in a concealed firing position scraped into a drainage depression at the edge of a sunflower field, the launch pod angled down and covered with a cut vegetation screen that radar hadn't penetrated during 2 Russian air defense sweeps of the area. The crew of 3. A fire control officer, a systems operator, and a vehicle driver who doubled as local security, had maintained communication silence except for scheduled check-ins, eating cold rations, sleeping in shifts, and watching the data feed from the TB2 relay showing the crossing pattern build across 3 days of observation. The fire control officer, we'll call him by his call sign, Zubr, the Ukrainian word for a European bison, an animal known for patience and power, had been selected for this mission specifically because of his experience with time-sensitive targeting. He had participated in 11 previous HIMARS strike operations. He understood the mathematics of a rocket in flight, the wind corrections required at range, the way a pontoon crossing would respond to different impact points. His pre-fire analysis had already determined that the highest value aim point was not the center of the pontoon itself, but the northern attachment point, the anchor assembly where the floating sections connected to the fixed bank approach. An M31 rocket hitting that connection point would not merely damage the pontoon, it would sever it. The downstream sections would drift. The entire crossing would fail within seconds, and any vehicle already on the span would be trapped. That calculation had been submitted to the strike cell and approved before the crew ever moved into position. The complication came 22 minutes before the strike window opened. Russian electronic warfare activity surged. A Krasuka 4 EW system operating from a position south of the Azov coastline began broadcasting across the frequency bands the TB2 relay was using to maintain the targeting data feed. The image degraded. Not completely. The TB2 switched to its backup frequency allocation and maintained partial surveillance. But the high-resolution vehicle track data Zubr's fire control system was using to refine the impact timing became intermittent. For approximately 8 minutes, the crew was operating on a degraded data picture. This was the moment the mission could have been scrubbed. Zubr made the call to hold. The pre-registered coordinates were still valid. The convoy pattern, established over 3 days of observation, was predictive enough that the timing model remained accurate within a margin the M31 round could accommodate. The partial TB2 feed showed the lead elements of the fuel convoy departing the northern assembly point on schedule. The math still worked. The strike cell confirmed the hold order with a 2-word authentication. Zubr locked the first fire control solution and waited. The Russian EW activity lasted 11 minutes before dropping off, likely a scheduled broadcast rather than a targeted counter-drone operation. The TB2 feed sharpened. The lead tanker, a Kamaz-based fuel carrier loaded with approximately 22,000 liters of diesel, was 3 minutes from the northern approach choke point. Zubr issued his fire control commands. The first pair of M31 rockets left the launch pod at 3:17 a.m. Each HIMARS M31 GMLRS rocket carries a 90-kilogram unitary warhead, GPS guided with inertial navigation backup, accurate to within 5 meters at maximum range. These 2 rounds were set for the northern attachment point, the anchor assembly. The second pair launched 11 seconds later, targeted on the center span of the pontoon. The third pair followed at a 20-second interval, targeted on the southern approach exit. Not the pontoon itself, but the dispersal area where vehicles would be attempting to accelerate clear of the crossing. 6 rounds, 3 target sets, 90 seconds of flight time to the crossing. The Russian air defense systems covering the area detected the launches. They always did at this range. The Buk M3 battery, positioned 8 kilometers south of the crossing, acquired the inbound tracks and attempted engagement. 29M 317M missiles were launched in response. Both missed. The HIMARS round flies a ballistic trajectory that the book engagement algorithm is optimized against, but the M31's GPS correction in the terminal phase introduced a trajectory variation the engagement solution hadn't fully accounted for. The book missiles detonated on proximity fuse 200 meters short of the lead HIMARS round. The lead tanker was on the center span when the first 2 rounds arrived. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. This is exactly the kind of combined arms precision that is changing the way armies plan logistics operations. The Northern Attachment Assembly took both M31 impacts within 1.4 seconds of each other at 3:18 a.m. and 47 seconds. The 90-kilogram warheads detonated in sequence, the second arriving while debris from the first was still in motion. The Anchor Assembly, a steel and concrete structure rated for sustained vehicle loading but not designed to absorb direct high-explosive impact at military grade, fractured at the primary connection points. The northern floating sections of the Pontoon, suddenly released from their anchoring, began to rotate counterclockwise under the Azov current, swinging the entire northern half of the crossing downstream and taking the vehicles on that section with them. The lead tanker was on the center span. The 2 center span rounds arrived at 3:18 a.m. and 59 seconds, 12 seconds after the attachment point impacts. The tanker had not been able to reverse. The driver had no warning. The first M31 impacted 12 meters forward of the tanker's cab, punching through the pontoon deck into the water, the warhead detonating in a shaped hydraulic blast that lifted the forward section of the pontoon 3 meters and then drove it back down. The second round, arriving 1.4 seconds behind the first, impacted directly beneath the tanker's fuel tank. 22,000 liters of diesel ignited. The fireball was visible from Ukrainian shore positions 12 kilometers away. Satellite imagery captured the thermal signature. The burning fuel spread across the water surface, flowing downstream with the Azov current, creating a secondary fire line that burned for 40 minutes. The 4 Russian vehicles queued behind the lead tanker on the pontoon. 2 additional fuel carriers and 2 escorting BTR-82A armored personnel carriers were caught in the expanding fire and the structural collapse of the center span sections. All 4 went into the water. The BTR-82A vehicles, with their amphibious capability, would normally survive a controlled water entry. These were not controlled entries. Both capsized on impact, their hatches sealed against the fire threat, trapping their crews inside. The southern dispersal rounds arrived at 3:19 a.m. and 8 seconds. The first vehicle to have successfully crossed. A third fuel tanker that had cleared the southern bank and was accelerating into the dispersal area was bracketed by the 2 M31 warheads as they impacted the packed gravel exit road. The blast overpressure from the first round disabled the tanker's engine and blew out all its glass. The driver was wounded by glass fragmentation but alive. The second round impacted 30 meters further along the dispersal track, directly into the path of a Russian escort vehicle, a Tiger light utility truck carrying a 4-man security element. The Tiger was destroyed. No survivors. The entire strike sequence, from first rocket launch to final impact, had taken 1 minute and 51 seconds. In those 111 seconds, the Russian fuel convoy had ceased to exist as an operational entity. How many vehicles did Ukraine destroy or render combat ineffective in this single strike operation? A, 23, B, 38, or C, 50? Hold that question. We'll give you the precise verified count before the video ends. The pontoon crossing was gone. That was the immediate assessment. But the true scope of the damage only became clear in the hour that followed as Ukrainian reconnaissance assets. The TB2 still on station, now operating freely after the Krasuka 4 broadcast had lapsed, plus 2 Ukrainian FPV drones scrambled from a forward position to conduct battle damage assessment, built a picture of what the HIMARS strike had actually achieved. The pontoon was divided into 3 sections by the strike. The northern section was rotating downstream, carrying 1 destroyed Russian vehicle on its deck as it drifted. The center section had collapsed, with the burning diesel tanker half submerged in the Azov shallows, still burning. The southern section remained attached to the far bank but was structurally compromised, listing at an angle that made it impassable. Russian engineers on the southern bank were already gathering, but they had no immediate capacity to repair the crossing. The damage to the anchor assembly was too severe for field repair, and the burning diesel on the water surface made any approach to the center section impossible until the fire burned out. That fire would take 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, the Russian fuel convoy queued on the northern approach road. 17 additional vehicles waiting for the crossing to clear sat stationary on an exposed road, fully fueled, fully laden, unable to cross, unable to reverse quickly through the narrow approach corridor without risking vehicles going into the drainage ditches flanking the road. The convoy commander, a Russian army logistics major, was frantically calling for air cover and air defense reinforcement on his radio. Those calls were later recovered from intercepted communications. The intercepts revealed the panic. The logistics major's radio traffic, translated and analyzed by Ukrainian signals intelligence, showed a commander who had not been briefed on the actual vulnerability of the crossing to precision strike. His communications referred repeatedly to assurances he had apparently received that the crossing was covered, and that Ukrainian HIMARS was not capable of engaging targets at this range, given Ukrainian ammunition constraints that Russian intelligence had assessed as binding. The HIMARS crew had just demonstrated those assessments were wrong. The intercepts also revealed something else. The 17 vehicles queued on the northern approach road included not just fuel tankers, but 3 vehicles carrying ammunition. Specifically, 152 artillery rounds being transported to support the offensive's fire support elements. Those vehicles had not been identified in the pre-strike targeting package because they had joined the convoy at the last assembly point after the satellite imagery window had closed. Ukrainian planners had struck a fuel convoy. What they had also struck, without knowing it, was an ammunition element. The secondary explosions from the ammunition carriers began 48 minutes after the HIMARS strike, triggered by burning debris from one of the still smoldering vehicles on the pontoon drifting downstream and igniting fuel spillage that had pooled in the road drainage. One 152 round cooking off in a confined space is dangerous. Approximately 600 rounds cooking off in 3 confined vehicles on a road flanked by drainage ditches produced a chain of explosions that lasted 22 minutes and destroyed 4 additional vehicles whose drivers had been attempting to use the road shoulder to turn around. If you believe tactics win wars, and this strike proves they do, type Ukraine radar in the comments right now. The total damage assessment, compiled from TB2 imagery, satellite confirmation, and OSINT analysis of combat footage posted by Russian soldiers in the area over the following days, produced a verified count that exceeded initial estimates. The primary HIMARS strike directly destroyed or rendered combat ineffective 4 vehicles on the pontoon crossing, 1 fuel tanker, 1 fuel carrier, 2 BTR-82A APCs, plus the escort Tiger. The pontoon crossing itself was non-functional for a minimum of 72 hours, requiring emergency engineering assets to be diverted from frontline support. The secondary explosions on the northern approach road destroyed 3 ammunition carriers and 4 additional vehicles caught in the blast zone. The total fuel destroyed, between the tankers directly hit and the cargo of the vehicles damaged in the secondary detonations, came to approximately 68,000 liters of diesel. At wartime consumption rates, that was roughly 19 hours of combined armored operations for the elements of the southern grouping that depended on this crossing. 19 hours. The offensive consumed 19 hours worth of fuel in the time it took Russian logistics planners to figure out their contingency. The human cost on the Russian side was significant. Ukrainian sources estimated between 22 and 31 personnel killed and an additional 14 to 19 wounded. The Buk M3 battery that had attempted to engage the HIMARS rounds expended 2 missiles in the failed intercept attempt. Missiles that cost approximately $3 million each and would now need to be replaced through a supply chain already strained by 18 months of intensive air defense operations. The HIMARS crew. Zuber and his 2 crew members had cleared their firing position within 4 minutes of the last launch. Standard HIMARS operating procedure after a strike is to move immediately to avoid counter-battery fire. The Russian counter-battery radar had detected the approximate launch area within 90 seconds of the first rocket's firing, and a Tornado G MLRS battery had been tasked to engage the position at 3:21 a.m. The Tornado G rounds arrived at the launch point at 3:26 a.m., 6 minutes after the HIMARS had vacated. Russian counter-battery fire struck an empty sunflower field. The crew was already moving to their second position, 14 kilometers east, where they would reload from a pre-positioned ammunition cache and await further tasking. What would NATO planners have done differently at this crossing? Would Allied doctrine have prioritized different aim points, different timing, different force layering? Comment your analysis. This is exactly the kind of tactical question that separates serious military observers from casual viewers, and we read every response. The Russian response to losing the pontoon crossing revealed the depth of the logistics crisis the strike had created. Within 6 hours of the attack, Russian military engineers were attempting to identify alternative crossing points along the same stretch of Azov coastline. 3 potential sites were evaluated. All 3 were rejected. 2 because they lacked the approach road infrastructure to handle convoy traffic. One, because satellite imagery analysis suggested Ukrainian surveillance coverage was already active in that area. The practical result was that the southern grouping's fuel supply through the Azov route was interrupted for 79 hours while emergency engineering assets were diverted to repair the damaged pontoon, and an alternative supply calculation was worked through the chain of command. 79 hours, in the middle of an active offensive phase. The impact on offensive tempo was measurable. Ukrainian General Staff reports covering the period noted a significant reduction in Russian armored vehicle activity in the sectors directly supplied through the Azov logistics route during the 79-hour interruption. Satellite imagery confirmed that Russian tank concentrations in the forward staging areas that had been building toward an operational weight were reduced. Vehicles dispersed, presumably to conserve fuel, during this window. A Ukrainian counterattack operation calibrated to exploit exactly this kind of Russian operational pause was launched 48 hours into the interruption and achieved its positional objectives with lower than projected resistance. The HIMARS strike on the pontoon crossing had not merely destroyed vehicles and fuel. It had created a 79-hour window in which Russian armored offensive capability was degraded, and Ukrainian commanders had been positioned to exploit that window before it closed. This is how modern interdiction warfare actually operates. Not the romantic notion of artillery duels and tank charges, but the cold mathematics of supply chains, crossing windows, fuel consumption rates, and the patient intelligence work that identifies the single point where precision force can create cascading effects. Zuber and his crew did not defeat a Russian offensive by outfighting a Russian armored column. They defeated it by understanding that an offensive cannot be conducted without fuel, that fuel cannot move without a crossing, and that a crossing, however improvised, however supposedly hidden, is a pre-registered coordinate waiting for the release order. The lesson cuts in both directions. For Ukrainian forces, this operation validated the intelligence fusion model that combines satellite imagery, persistent drone surveillance, and human partisan networks into a targeting picture that HIMARS can act on. The 79-hour effect on Russian logistics was not produced by the rockets alone. It was produced by 61 hours of patient observation, building the targeting data that made the rockets effective. Patience and intelligence are multipliers. Without them, even HIMARS fires at empty roads. For Russian forces, this operation exposed a fundamental miscalculation in operational security planning. The pontoon was treated as a temporary installation that Ukrainian precision capability could not or would not prioritize. Both assumptions were wrong. Any crossing point, no matter how improvised, no matter how recently constructed, is targetable if Ukrainian surveillance assets can observe it long enough to build a pattern. The Russian counter-assumption that their own EW capability would prevent Ukrainian precision guidance from functioning was refuted by the M31's GPS plus inertial redundancy, which maintained accuracy through the Krasuka 4 interference window. The North Korean ammunition in those three carriers on the northern approach road represented a separate calculation worth noting. Russian logistics by this phase of the war had integrated North Korean artillery rounds into its supply chain as a partial substitute for depleted Russian domestic production. The presence of those rounds in the convoy was confirmed by OSINT analysis of debris imagery. The distinctive markings on shell casings recovered from the explosion site were consistent with North Korean 152mm production runs. Those rounds never reached the frontline batteries they were intended for. They added to the secondary explosion total instead. Now, the answer to today's tactical quiz. How many vehicles did Ukraine destroy or render combat ineffective in this strike? The answer is B, 38, not 23 and not 50, though both numbers appeared in early Ukrainian source reporting before the full BDA was completed. The verified count, cross-referenced across TB2 imagery, satellite confirmation, and OSINT analysis, stands at 38 vehicles across the direct strike and secondary explosion sequence. That includes the 5 vehicles directly destroyed in the primary HIMARS impact sequence on the pontoon and dispersal area, the 3 ammunition carriers and 4 additional road vehicles destroyed in the secondary explosions, and 26 additional vehicles damaged beyond immediate operational use by blast overpressure, fire spread, and structural collapse of the pontoon that trapped or damaged. Convoy vehicles attempting emergency maneuver on the approach road. 38 vehicles. 1 HIMARS crew. 61 hours of waiting. 3 questions that serious military analysts are still debating about this strike. Was the decision to hold through the EW degradation window the right call? Zuber's assessment that the pre-registered coordinates remained valid without real-time data refresh was vindicated by the outcome, but the risk calculation was genuinely difficult. A strike launched with degraded data could have missed the crossing window entirely, wasted 6 HIMARS rounds that represent a significant portion of Ukraine's precision munitions allocation, and alerted Russian forces to relocate the crossing without destroying it. The argument for scrubbing and waiting for better conditions is a legitimate one. What would you have done? Could the Russian southern grouping have prevented this strike? The Krasuka 4 EW activity suggests they were aware of the general threat, and the Bukem 3 intercept attempt shows active air defense engagement. But the pontoon itself was used on a predictable pattern without varying the crossing windows, without changing approach routes, and without deploying counter-drone coverage dense enough to defeat the TB2's altitude-range combination. A different operational security protocol, random crossing windows, active counter-drone patrols, multiple dispersed crossing points used in rotation, would have made this targeting picture far more difficult to develop. The pattern was the vulnerability. Breaking the pattern would have reduced it. And finally, what does this strike tell us about the future of logistics operations under persistent drone and satellite surveillance? The era in which temporary infrastructure could be constructed and used with reasonable confidence that the adversary couldn't observe it in time to engage, it appears to be ending. If a pontoon assembled in 72 hours can be pre-registered and struck with 6 rockets 90 seconds after launch order based on 61 hours of patient observation, what does that mean for river crossing operations in any future high-intensity conflict? The answer has implications that reach well beyond this war. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Will the Southern grouping's logistics planners adapt in time, or will this crossing pattern be repeated somewhere else along the Azov coast? Comment YES or no, and if you've studied Russian logistics doctrine, tell us why in the comments. We read every response. The Azov shoreline is quiet now. The fire burned out. The pontoon sections drifted. The wrecks remain, half submerged, rusting, a navigational hazard in shallow water where fuel stains still mark the surface on still mornings. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes logistical overconfidence without mercy. Real tactics, real consequences. Ukraine Radar. Stay vigilant.